So starting with the recording of the Revolver album, Geoff Emerick was on the scene. Here's where it is so obvious this young man had been paying attention. Now this was perfect timing for the Beatles. You see, they were already pushing the recording boundaries with their last album, Rubber Soul. Now by the beginning of the recording sessions for Revolver, the Beatles' biggest sonic complaint up to that point was the lack of bass response in their recording. Paul especially was upset with this because he was hearing recordings from Motown in America where the bass was full and the bottom end sounded wonderful. Now the Beatles had been told up to that point, although EMI, Abbey Road, had world-class equipment, America, as far as recording pop music, was ahead of the game. Now it's just right around this time that Paul had written Paperback Writer. John had also written Rain. They were both in contention for the A-side of the Beatles' next single. Now both recordings, of course, are known for special recording achievements, and each one of them is known for its wonderful bass sound. You see, Geoff Emerick had been thinking. He knew that a speaker basically is a microphone, and a microphone is basically a speaker wired in reverse. Now it's not that simple, but basically that was the principle. So he started thinking, what if I rewired a bass cabinet speaker so that it would record another bass cabinet speaker plugged into Paul's new Rickenbacker bass, which by the way was already improving his bass sounds, and he wondered what would happen. He talked it over with a few engineers and they thought he was nuts. But he talked to Ken Townsend and Ken Townsend thought the idea had merit. They both discussed on how to accomplish this. By this time, George Martin and the Beatles were used to Geoff Emerick achieving better sounds. He had already demonstrated with his close miking techniques that he could achieve sounds that engineers had not achieved up to that point. A better sound on Ringo's bass drum? Stuff a four-neck sweater into it. Shove the microphone super close, and voila, you've got a sound like you've never heard before. George Martin hearing the possibilities of yet another orchestration like he did on Yesterday. Paul thinking, oh, wait a minute, we've done that before. Geoff Emerick thinking, close miking. Now it's interesting, when he put the microphones real close to the string players, he noticed they kept backing up. Later, when he shoved these microphones in front of horn players, they were all for it. And of course, he did that with Got to Get You Into My Life. But this time, they recorded not just a quartet like they did with the song Yesterday, they recorded an octet. And this time, the microphones were so close, you could hear the bows crossing the strings. This was a different and more exciting, more intimate, more direct orchestration than we had ever heard before in a pop record. Now it's interesting, George Martin laid claim to having the idea of taking pre-recorded music, chopping it up, throwing it in the air, and then having it spliced back together in order to get a different kind of sound on John Lennon's For the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Yet here in the book we realize this was a trick he learned from Geoff Emerick, and the trick was first performed on the recording of Yellow Submarine. They had left a short, small section in the song for an oompa band. That's where they got the idea of going into EMI's recording vaults and retrieving some music that would fit the bill. Geoff Emerick and George Martin chopped up that tape into 1-inch splices, threw it into the air, reattached it, and it's interesting. It came back almost identical to the original recording. That's when they just switched a couple and it was different enough so that EMI would not have to pay for that recording every time that Beatle record was played on the radio. So great art from a budget-friendly producer and an even more capable sound engineer. John Lennon needs his voice to sound like a Dalai Lama from a hill. Let's put his voice through an organ speaker a Leslie speaker. It revolves, we'll put a mic on the side, and it'll warble his voice. John Lennon was delighted. I think that idea came from Ken Townsend as well as Townsend's idea on ADT, or artificial doubling technique. He developed that technique because John Lennon did not want to spend hours re-recording his voice, as they often did, to thicken the voice. That's an old studio trick. Have somebody record the lead vocals and then have them re-record the lead vocals as identical to that one, and it thickens the presence of the lead vocals in a pop mix. John Lennon was always known to cut to the chase and get the recording done. And of course, the ADT technique was more than up to the job. The same closed mic techniques we talked about earlier, he used when miking Indian music for the first time. Adding to the mystic drone those instruments already offered, no one had recorded them sounding like that before. After hours of trying to get the right solo for Taxman, George Harrison finally gives Paul a run at it. The solo is so perfect, they decide they'll just double it again and fly it in at the end. So really, we get Paul McCartney's solo twice within one song. A very simple but effective technique. Nobody had really thought in these terms before as far as pop music being recorded. They were, for the first time, producing music that really couldn't just be readily reproduced live on stage. This was no longer their primary concern. Their main concern now was to make the very best music that they could possibly make in the studio. If that meant breaking every rule there was, so be it. And you know, the Beatles themselves, the four Beatles, weren't the only rule breakers there. George Martin readily relinquished control as the Beatles grew. Geoff Emerick was more than willing to break rules to get the sonic palette that he heard in his head. He was the first recording engineer that ever spoke of music in colors. When I first read that that's how he saw music, I started seeing music in that way too. Now, my color palette isn't the same as his. We probably all have our own way of seeing music, but here we see what an embarrassment of riches the Beatles had. First of all, as a band, they were an embarrassment of riches. Then they had what I consider to be the very best pop producer of all time, George Martin. Their manager, Brian Epstein, was brilliant in the way that he had presented them, and the almost constant accruement of technical wizards that were available to these four young men thoroughly amazes me. No other band in history can lay claim to such a miraculous alignment of personnel and events. They were blessed by their own talent, further blessed by those who didn't have quite that talent, but could offer them what they did not have. And they were smart enough to take it. You know, one of Geoff Emerick's best memories of recording Revolver was when he worked one-on-one with Paul McCartney after everyone would leave the studio. Paul would start working on his bass lines, inserting note by note exactly what he wanted. This would continue onward and through the recording of Sgt. Pepper. And this is why we hear some of the very best pop bass playing by anyone on these two albums.